Getting your startup draft right is extremely important, and it's not as easy as jumping into a fresh new league and hitting start on the draft. There's a lot you need to know about how to prepare for your next Dynasty Startup Draft, and Zach and I are diving into those things today. Before we get into it, I do hope you'll enjoy the video. Please leave a like if you do. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. What things are you doing that we did not mention here today to prepare for your next Dynasty Startup Draft? And if you're interested in even more help when it comes to your next Dynasty Startup Draft, check out the pinned comment in the YouTube description box for more details on how we can help you do that. But with all that said, let's get right to the content you came for. Zach, we are back today talking about what the people need to know about their next Dynasty Startup Draft before their next Dynasty Startup Draft. We're going to get right into it. We got some fun stuff to go over today. The first thing I wanted to bring to the table is all leagues are different and you need to study the league. You need to be a student to this league, the student of the format. You need to evaluate the league size, roster limits, required starting allocations, all of these things. Because if you don't do that right off the rip, you're going to be at a disadvantage. You're going to have a poor strategy. What you're doing will more than likely be for naught. Like you're not going to get lucky in a draft and having done none of the research. And I think too many people want to go into a draft and hey, getting into a new league, it's fun. You got all these people. You don't want to be the guy hanging things up and, saying, hey, wait a minute, I'd like to take 45 minutes to go actually learn about what the league settings are and things like that. But you need to figure out all the, and on top of all that, I already mentioned the positional premiums too in place. Is it tight end premium or is it 6-point passing touchdown, 4-point, whatever the case is? What are all these scoring things that are in place and how do these things impact your league as a whole? A great way to find that out, how it does do that, is on Sleeper, especially. I know you can probably do it in other formats. I'm just not familiar with it. But you can go to, filter to last year stats, the leaders, last year stats, 2022 full season stats, and you can just see what positions were favored. And that doesn't necessarily make a cue for you, but it does give you a good idea of what positions are favorable in terms of the scorings and things like that. And it's just a great way to kind of give you a good picture of what to look for in your drafts and maybe how to build your rosters too, because obviously if there's 3 starting wide receivers that you need and 3 flex spots, you're going to need a ton of wide receivers. Like that's just plain and simple. Same if there's more running backs or less flexes, that's all things to take into consideration. How big is a starting roster in general? Is it a start 8 where you need studs, or is it a start 11 where you really need to focus on depth? All of these things, super important. Zach, feel free to touch on anything I just mentioned. If you want to add on to anything, feel free, or dive on into your next point.
Yeah, I think the most important part of that, Bob, is just knowing how many starters, right?
Yeah.
Because it changes your entire strategy having to start 8 or having to start 10 or 11. That
Mhm.
changes everything. If you need 8, you can kind of maybe manipulate the draft board and trade up a couple times, which we'll
Mhm.
talk about ad nauseum in these startup videos, trading up, trading down. But just for me, obviously the running backs, wide receiver, super flex, tight end premium, very important. But start 8 versus start 11, massive difference in how I'm constructing that team.
I will say, Zach, you touched on a great point with that. Being if it's a start 8, you can obviously absolutely manipulate the board and trade up more often than not. Whereas if it is that start 11, you really need to be focused on trading back and acquiring,
Mhm.
more pieces in the draft, especially in that like top 6 round range. If you can pick up a couple extra picks by trading out of the first round and getting pieces that can help, fill out the entirety of your roster to where you have just more great starting talent throughout your board. But if it is at start 8, like we've always touched on, you need those high end pieces. You need to focus on trading up, and it's worth it in that case. But with all of that said, Zach, what is your first bit of advice when it comes to things you need to know for your Dynasty Startup Draft?
For me, it's always having a strategy in place. What is my approach to this team? And the thing I like to do is have different approaches to different dynasty leagues I'm in. Let's go win now here. Let's go 25 and under in this league. Let's go give me all the first round picks next year and let me try and soak up some value later. So have a strategy going into the draft. Now, whatever that strategy is, I will say for the first 3 to 4 rounds, I am typically going best player available.
Sure.
Once I get to a certain point where there's a significant drop off in the level of starters, right? Like I'm talking about like that Chris Godwin area of the draft where I could draft this guy, but I could maybe get somebody who could do what Chris Godwin is doing at a lower draft spot. So like I said, I think for the first 3, 4, 5 rounds, you can go best player available. And then it's time for your strategy to kick in gear. Are you trying to win now? Can you move up into the 6th, 7th round and take 2 or 3 players in those rounds to help you win now? Or can I draft younger players at this point? And that may not help me win in 2023 or whatever year I'm doing my startup draft, but may help me win in 2024, 2025. I think a great example of that is maybe Kendre Miller right now. Kendre Miller, I don't think is going to help me win games now, but I do think he will do that in a year or two when he's part of either the starting running back on that team or part of the committee of that team. So have a strategy in place and follow through with that strategy after the first, I would say, 3, 4 rounds of your startup draft.
I 100% agree. I think just having something in place of some intention, I think that's so huge. When we talk about, when you have a team trajectory in mind, when you have an existing team, you should kind of have the same thing in mind where you're just trying to making moves throughout your draft that fit a pathway. Because if you end up doing all of these things, once you're finished drafting, you're going to be left with a team that's very all over the place. And that's, good to some degrees, possibly depending on how your draft shakes out. But honestly, going one way or the other, having that win now mentality, having some sort of different mentality is good for your draft at the end of the day. And then also too, I will say, like you mentioned, with all of your drafts, you go some different way. You don't necessarily have one set mindset. I think that just offers a nice variety to the leagues you're dealing with, as opposed to all of my leagues are win now, cool, which at some point, hey, that'd be dope if you were at that point, great. But I think there's some fun in the variety of just types of leagues you have going on and things you're trying to do and implement and experiment with other leagues and things like that. I think that adds a nice little fun element as well. But having some sort of strategy in mind or some sort of identity that you're trying to build your team with, I think that's excellent. I think that's huge to keep yourself out of the middle right off the bat. I think that's where you're going to end up if you don't have that intent. That's just going to be where you end up. Moving on to my next bit, and this is somewhat twofold, but we need to have some sort of tiered rankings or resource we trust or make our own tiered rankings where we have a set list of how we want to kind of maneuver down the board in terms of value, in terms of player belief, extent of their careers and things like that, how we want to target these guys. And ultimately, we talk about trading down a lot. Having tiered rankings is a great way to manipulate down the board. This can highlight pathways down the draft board where if you have 4 players in this tier, you're picking at the top of the tier to start with. You can slide all the way back to that back of that tier, pick up some value. Doesn't have to be earth-shattering value. It can be a very simple piece, can be a, improve a pick later in the draft. That's awesome to do. Improving assets is a plus asset as well, in my opinion. Or you can pick up future rookie draft capital as well. All of these things are great. And then the other thing to keep in mind too, as reaches occur throughout the draft, which they will happen, it will happen. People will be reached on. These do extend tiers. And the more you have this kind of in place already, the more you can kind of have it in mind as the draft board ticks down and further, that just opens up more opportunities for you to trade down the board and things like that. And that's just how you kind of can maximize the value of the tiers you have, as opposed to just having them and using them as a cue to draft in the same spot. Don't want to do that. But ultimately, just having this in place gives you a way to, like I said, create those pathways down the board and just add as much value as possible throughout your draft while not losing out on the player quality that you have on your roster, as opposed to just, oh, I'm just going to trade down a full round to get all of this haul or whatever I can get. You're trading down far more strategically and keeping the same players in mind, and you're tiering down, but laterally and adding value on top of the player or pick that you're getting. Zach, feel free to touch on this point if you need to at all or if you'd want to, or feel free to dive on into your next point.
I think for your point there, Bob, it's just important to be honest with yourself about the players in your specific tier, because a lot of times I'm like, let's just say I'm looking at Dameon Pierce, right? And we're in a tier of Dameon Pierce, Rashad White, Isaiah Pacheco. And I'm like, oh, I'll take any of those guys. I really like Dameon Pierce, but let me move back 10 spots. I'll take this extra 4th round, 3rd round pick, whatever it is. And then Dameon Pierce gets picked. And all of a sudden, you're like, damn it. You have to be honest with yourself in terms of that tier of players. And are you truly okay if the player that you're kind of targeting is selected? are you okay taking someone else in that tier? That's all I'll say. It's a great point. But a lot of, and this is a mistake that I have made, and that's why I think this is a great point, is a lot of times I'm like, yeah, I'll be okay with Isaiah Pacheco, no problem. And then Dameon Pierce is taken. I'm like, dang it. Why did I do that? For a third round pick? Like, why did I do that? So just be honest with yourself with the tier of players there is all.
Yeah, no, 100% agree on that. I think too that, that is definitely an element to take into mind or keep in mind. And, when you're making tiered rankings, this is where if you have, somebody that you're following that you have tiered rankings of, we have tiered rankings at patreon.com/Dynasty Rewind. But whoever you're following, if you make your own, definitely keep that in mind that when you're starting up your draft, if you do miss out on that guy because you made that trade down, are you going to feel like Zack did about it? Like I would too in that case. So I'd much rather have Dameon Pierce. I have him much higher ranked than Rachaad White in that case. So absolutely 100% great addition to make. We will circle back on this point a little bit as we get into one of your future points a little bit to make this point in full, I guess we'll say. But feel free to touch on your next point, and we'll go from there.
A big part of not just Dynasty fantasy football, but just fantasy sports in general is the psychological aspect, right? And this is, I think I'm the person that talks about this the most on the channel, and I'm living proof of this. Like, be present in the league, talk to people, engage with people, make fun of people in a light manner, make fun of yourself, right? And that's getting to know your league. But in the startup draft, Bob, what you need to follow through on is analyzing what the other teams are doing. It's going to take a little while for this to happen. I would say after a good 5 to 6 rounds, where maybe half the starters on everybody's teams are filled, you can start to see the trends of the league. What teams are trying to win now? What teams are trying to build young? What teams are just trading out for first-round picks? And how do I relate my draft plan to these teams? Is the team in front of me always taking younger players, and I am also trying to take younger players? Do I now need to move up 2 or 3 spots before this person comes back around? And the other way, Bob, is this person trying to win now? Are they potentially interested in my draft pick? I could pick up another draft pick 2-3 rounds later and another second-round pick in next year's rookie draft. How can I manipulate the draft knowing what the other teams in the startup draft are doing? Look at the trends. Look at who they are drafting, right? Another great example is, what if one team has taken like 3 quarterbacks already? There are teams that take 4, 5, 6 quarterbacks just because. Do I need to take a quarterback now or be left out in the cold? So that's where we get into the conversation of best player available, yada, 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 so on and so forth. But just to put this in a vacuum is, learn what your league mates are doing in the first 5 to 6 rounds, and how does it relate to what my plan is, and how can I use that information in my benefit to my strategy?
I absolutely love this point, Zack. One of the ones that I have for, not that we'll talk about today or in any future videos coming up anytime soon, is just sometimes league mates will tell you exactly what you need to do to make a move, to win a trade in, the broad spectrum of things. Use what's said as leverage. When a league mate says something like, shoot, I just got sniped, use this as an opportunity to move in, make your move, pick up, trade up at that point for value, while they're still thinking about who they're going to draft next. Let them kick that can down the road a little bit, but definitely have that trade up opportunity. Then you also have a possible trade down partner that you could incentivize to trade up later so that they don't get sniped again. Once a person gets sniped, they don't want to get sniped again. And you can use that again to your advantage. But keep in mind too, along with everything that they do in the draft, keep in mind what they're saying when they're saying looking to trade up, looking to trade back, investigate, take the time to listen to your league mates. It'll make navigating your draft that much easier, and you'll gain that much more value throughout the draft, which is a huge part, in my opinion, in dynasty startups, is just finding ways to get as much value on your roster as possible to start your dynasty league off with. If you end up with the most value right off the rip, you can do some great things pretty quickly in your league. It won't take long for you to ascend to be this crazy good team at some point at the end of the day. Moving on to this next point, we want to have rankings, but we also want to have an idea for how the draft board is going to fall. And to do this, I want to have a trusted source for ADP available, whether it's the platform you're on, multiple platforms, whatever the case is. Just having an idea for how the draft board is going to fall and then comparing that to your rankings and then finding spots where you might be reaching on players per your valuations, or you might be getting players at value per your valuations per the ADP suggested. So keep this in mind. This is just another way to gauge value throughout the board and things like that. The best thing you can do with this point paired with my previous point about tiered rankings is using them to combine to see where those tier breaks are with the community and where the tier breaks that you have are. And then, like I said before, you can utilize these to find little value pockets that you can maneuver around and things like that to get the most out of a trade down and, kind of manipulate where a perceived tier break is for the community, but you might foresee as the middle of a tier break. You can use that to gain value on your picks as you move along down the board. Let's just say, for an example, say that the perceived tier break is at your pick at 108, but you and your rankings believe the tier extends to pick 11. You can make a trade down with this pick and add additional value to your asset pool while still obtaining a player you believe to be of equal value compared to what you would have gotten before trading down. This is just a way to utilize ADP, not as a Bible or anything like that. We want to primarily work off our rankings, but we do want to know or have an idea of how the board may fall, because love it or hate it, ADP, most people will work off of ADP when they're drafting. And that is, I think, a mistake. But I do think that instead of demonizing ADP and just saying ADP is terrible wherever you go, whatever the case is, there's some good ADP out there, but using multiple resources for ADP and using that as a somewhat of a guide to just see what the average community is doing, because that's what it stands for, average draft position. So you want to see what the community is doing compared to your rankings. Utilize the middle ground to soak up as much value as you can. Zach, feel free to touch on this point or dive on into your next one.
I think it's very interesting where let's say you're drafting on Sleeper, right? And you have the ADP up of what Sleeper is giving you. A lot of times, and I don't know what the rhyme or reason is with Sleeper, that information is not updated. And so that's where what you're saying, Bob, would come into play. And, we've got plenty of resources. We have our own rankings on our Patreon. It's definitely, you want to get an idea, because a lot of times you may plan for your draft according to the Sleeper ADP, and you could miss out on a player, or the other way around, right? Like, you need to scroll that whole, like, we had a startup draft recently, Bob, you and I, where Jonathan Mingo and Jaden Reed were way lower than what their ADP should have been, and nobody saw it but me. So it's a situation where you need, it's like Bob said, you need to take your time. Everybody's got, it should be a slow draft. Research ADP on the app that you're doing, but research other ADP as well to know what's a good selection, what's a value selection, what's not a value selection, because it can work for you both ways there, Bob.
And I would say that I think this next point of yours kind of touches on this well, or how to kind of another way to manipulate the ADP to your favor to put you above average in terms of ADP instead. What do you got for us?
Yeah, this is something I've only recently been doing because it's very annoying to do. But at the same time, we're talking about drafts that should be slower drafts, where there's plenty of time between picks and between your own selection, sometimes hours on hours or even days before you're selecting again. Set a queue of players. Make sure that you, like we just said, go through that ADP on Sleeper, scroll all the way down. If it's a 12-team draft for 30 rounds, do the math. That's 300 and some odd picks. So scroll all the way down and look at what players you might be targeting later throughout the draft. And it's a way to help you out too. Like, let's say your queue, you've got a lot of players in a queue at a certain tier, right? And your selection is not within the next 3-4 selections, and you see players in that tier getting taken, that may be an opportunity where you need to trade up a few spots. So just it's tedious and it's kind of minor, but we are talking about a collection of small differences that make one big difference in how your startup draft, which is supposed to set up your dynasty league for the next 4 or 5 years. And for me, I've recently been setting a queue in rookie drafts and startup drafts, and I really noticed the difference in how it changes my approach a little bit, because I'm like, oh, Jaden Reed is all the way down there, 200s. Maybe nobody else will see that except for me, and I might be able to grab him a little bit later than what I typically would if his ADP was updated on Sleeper. So these kinds of situations, can only help you out. They can't really hurt you. So setting a queue of your players and your priorities is something that I found to be very helpful in the last few months.
Yeah, 100%. And this is one too where you can utilize, touching back on a previous point again, those tiered rankings. This is where you can just have those smack right into your queue as far as you care to go. And then you can kind of manipulate that as you go along the board to see which positions in similar tiers are actually better for you and should be higher up in your queue. Like if you passed on running back earlier, now you have running backs and wide receivers in a similar tier, go get that running back. It makes more sense to fill out your roster. You're sticking with a similar value. Makes a lot of sense, especially if you're not dealing with, positional premiums and things like that, where you just need to fill more wide receivers. That maybe it doesn't make more sense to take the wide receiver at that point, but you get it. Definitely a great way to kind of blend points together. And just, I think something we've touched on in the past too is just like not being flustered when you're on the board, and having that kind of groundwork laid in the beginning or before your next pick. Maybe you adjust after your previous pick, whatever the case is, adjusting your board so that when your next pick is up, you're not panicking, you're not flustered. If, say somebody you were hoping to get isn't there, it's not the end of the world. It's not something that's going to take you long to rectify or think about your next move. I just think it's a good strategy overall. Like you said, it's small, it's somewhat tedious for sure, but at the end of the day, as I've felt with everything in life, the more you put into something, the more you're going to get out of it. And I think this is just a way that a Dynasty Startup Draft can tell you that much too. We're getting deep here on the Dynasty Rewind today, but that is okay. Moving on to my last little bit here. And this is just something I wanted to touch on because I feel like a lot of people make mistakes going into their drafts when it comes to things like this. So making startup draft picks versus rookie draft picks makes sense. Future rookie draft picks. So a lot of the times, and this is primarily new players, eventually you kind of get a better feel for it and things like that, where a lot of players will feel, oh, it's a first round pick. It's the same thing, same value. A startup draft pick is so much more valuable than a rookie draft pick. And I don't think people really understand that, but this is another reason why, to make this all make sense, we need to have that ADP resource available. Sorry, I'm going to be reading off a sheet here because I know people don't like when I do that, but there's a lot of points I want to get to and I want to make sure I hammer them all. But this is another reason why we have that, to assess startup draft pick values as accurately as possible, especially compared to those rookie draft picks of the future. And this is a thing too, where unfortunately, more experienced league mates, if you're in leagues with, players who are far more experienced than you, you're a newer player, you just happen to stumble on into a league with a bunch of experienced vets, let's say, they will try to take advantage. It's just natural practice. It just happens. It's unfortunate, but it's just kind of fact of the matter is. But this is where knowing the current rookie draft ADP can help your cause as well. See where the rookies that are going in the mid to late part of your first round of rookie drafts per ADP, the rookie ADP that is, compared to the startup draft ADP. That is a more pick for pick equivalent for a future rookie first round pick. You can do the same with rookies in the second and third rounds of rookie drafts as well. If you want to find similar pick for pick values when it comes to trading down or up in a startup, you can use similar strategies to find the proper value. Instead of just trying to trade up with round and pick numbers, try putting a name to the pick. This is where ADP can come in handy again. Seeing that some Dynasty players are far more familiar with the player value than a startup pick, this can provide better insight into the valuation of the trade. Let's just say, for an example, you're trying to trade up from the 405 to the 305, and they're offering the 709 on top. Now go to your trusty ADP resource to see what players are typically kicking around those ranges, and then how do you feel about that value when it comes to that. Now, not all players have a good feel for value when it comes to the players involved as opposed to just draft picks. And that's okay. If you're still unsure, this is where you can ask a friend, ask a community Discord. We have a community Discord as well. If you have questions about startup trades, we can help you out there as well. Or you can go find a trade calculator or calculators that can give you some idea of where the market value may believe the value is. They may even be able to assist you in finding out what is needed to help better the value of the deal for you or entice your trade partner into making a better deal. This is definitely easily one of the most common mistakes I see in startup drafts, especially for newer players. And we have a lot of new players in our Dynasty, in our Discords and things like that, we fortunately haven't seen any gross mistakes like that in most startups, but I've seen it plenty in just my own, off-brand startups that I've gotten into where players are trading away rookie picks. And this is a thing where if you do it bad enough, can set you back for years. Like, this is a thing where if you trade both of your first round picks or both of your, let's say your startup first for a future first straight up, I mean, your first is probably not going to be very good for starters. So thank God for that. But just not proper value. It doesn't add up, doesn't shake out. But this will definitely set you back years. It can damage you if you don't know it well enough. Zach, feel free to touch on this or any other points to wrap this thing up.
Yeah, this is a very interesting one. And a lot of times I end up having to dumb down the trade to the person who's offering it to me, right?
Yeah.
Because let's just make this a hypothetical situation where somebody's trying to trade. I'm trying to trade out of the first round. Somebody else is trying to trade into the first round. It's very rare that you get a good offer right off the bat.
Right.
And part of that is you are trying to trade for a top 12 dynasty asset. It's very rare that a rookie comes in and is a top 12 dynasty asset, which I think we could consider Bijan Robinson. That somebody's trying to trade into the top 12 or whatever it may be. You're trying to get a top 30 dynasty asset, and you're sending me back down to the 50s or 60s. I need to be compensated for that. And so that is the way you have to break it down sometimes to these opponents to say, I'm willing to do this, but it is going to clearly cost me A, being good now, and B, the risk now gets set onto me because I'm taking a worse player and I'm taking a rookie. So I need to be compensated for that. And sometimes that's the conversation that needs to happen for the other person. And just let it marinate. Let that marinate sometimes, because the other person that sends you an offer or you are negotiating with clearly wants somebody. They very much want somebody. And as we talked about earlier, this is a psychological game at some points. Dynasty and fantasy football is very psychological in certain parts. And if you just wait and let that play, whatever, Chris Olave, let Chris Olave sit in your mind for a minute, Bob. That might make you want to trade up. I might have to give that first round pick next year, So just let it marinate for a few minutes. Check back in. Say, hey, you make up your mind, So it's a very interesting part. It's a strategical part. Is that even a word?
Yeah, sure.
It's a very strategical aspect of Dynasty Fantasy Football. We've used this word a lot. We always have like one word of a video. This word is manipulate. This is how you manipulate your startup draft, your next year's rookie draft, and even your league at certain points, because you may take the hit in year one, but you're set up in year two to be in charge of this league going forward.
The big note in all of these points is really to find ways to get the most value onto your roster. And I think, and to not get value off of your roster. I think that's when you start making mistakes, is when you start shipping off value, through poor trades, whatever the case is. And the unfortunate part is like, as a new Dynasty player, guess what? You're going to be in Dynasty startups. It's going to be a foreign environment to you. You're going to make mistakes. It's just kind of natural, unfortunately. I'm not saying go try to make these mistakes to have to learn from them and learn what you have to do to get out of that bottom of the barrel, I guess you could say. We do have videos that would help with that as well. And we do have a community Discord that would help with that as well. But ultimately, I think at the end of the day, finding ways to get the value onto your roster, keep it there. Once you start with a large value bank, as a term that I've been developing over time in the background of doing my own things, definitely a case of where you can start to dominate the league based off of what value you're able to build coming out of your startup draft. And we'll be talking about how to dominate the in-startup draft part in another video. While that is it for the video today, and I do hope you all enjoyed, please leave a like if you did. Comment down below your thoughts on the video itself. Let us know your takeaways from the video and what else you are doing to help in your Dynasty startup drafts. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, if you do need more help with your Dynasty startup draft, we do have Dynasty startup draft guides available. You can check out the pinned comment below or the YouTube description box for more details on how to get one of those. If you enjoyed this strategic video, I'm sure you'll like a bunch more that we have. Check out the playlist on your screen now, where we dive into a bunch of Dynasty strategies on how to win your league and dominate your league. You won't want to miss it. But hey, that's going to be it for us today. We will see y'all in the next one. But until then, I hope that y'all have a good one.